Mr. President, I'd like to share with the Senate and those following this debate a story about a man named Alton Mills. Alton Mills was a young African-American in the city of Chicago. He was an above-average high school student. It looked like he might even go on to higher education. But he had some bad luck when it came to employment and jobs, and he made a stupid decision. He made a stupid decision by becoming part of a gang in the neighborhood that was selling drugs. As a result of that, he was arrested, convicted of possession and sale of a small amount of narcotics, and the sentence was suspended because he had no previous criminal record. It happened a second time. And again, didn't serve a day in jail. It was suspended with the promise he'd never do it again, and he stumbled and did it a third time. As a result of that, in 1994, at the age of 24, Alton Mills was given a mandatory sentence of life in prison. He had never been involved in a violent crime, never used a firearm, and never was a drug kingpin, but he had been involved in the sale of drugs. A life sentence at age 24 for the three incidents which I've just mentioned. How could we have ever reached a point where a person would be sent to jail for life for those three crimes? We reached that point because 25 years ago we did something which was just plain wrong. You'll seldom hear a senator say this in the course of a speech, but I'm going to say it. The worst vote I ever cast in my life in the House or the Senate was for the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. In other words, if you took the same amount of cocaine and it was in a powder form sitting next to the same amount of cocaine in a crystallized form that could be smoked, and you were arrested for possession of one or the other, the sentence for crack cocaine was 100 times what it was for powder cocaine. Why did we do that? Why did we have such a gross disparity? Because we were frightened. As a member of the House of Representatives, I remember it well. They came to us and said, there's a new form of cocaine on the street. It costs $5. It is heavily addictive. And if a mother ingests this cocaine while she is pregnant, it can harm the fetus for life. Do something. And about that same time, there was this great scandal here in Washington, D.C. An outstanding basketball player at the University of Maryland named Lynn Bias overdosed on drugs and died. People were talking about his career in the NBA and this great talent, and he was dead. It had nothing to do with crack cocaine, but it was part of the environment and part of the overreaction that took place among politicians in Washington. I was one of them. I voted for that 100-to-1 disparity, saying we've got to send a hard, tough message right now. We did. 100-to-1. It didn't have any measurable impact on drug sales in the United States, but it had a measurable impact on the number of people who were incarcerated in the United States and the length of their incarceration. Those votes, the votes that I cast, and many like me, on both sides of the aisle, resulted in mandatory sentences for people like Alton Mills. A life sentence. A life sentence. Well, let me tell you how the Alton Mills story ends before I go on. Alton Mills, after serving 24 years in prison for those three street sales, came to my attention through a criminal defendant's attorney named, of all things, my angel Cody. She was Alton's angel, that's for sure. She fought for him, and she believed that he deserved better than to spend the rest of his life rotting in prison for those stupid decisions he made in his early life. I appealed to President Obama to commute his sentence, and the president agreed to do that. So after all that service behind bars, Alton Mills was released. What's he doing today? He's a mechanic at the Chicago Transit Authority. He repairs the buses that I ride on. He got married. He's now working with his daughter and his new grandchild. He's contributing to society. He's a community college student where he's pursuing an associate's degree. Finally, his life's on the right track. If he hadn't received a pardon, Alton Mills would have died in prison because of our existing federal sentencing laws. But yesterday, something happened which is remarkable. President Donald Trump had a press conference with representatives of law enforcement and announced that he was going to support legislation which I've been working on for quite some time with Senator Lee and Senator Grassley to change the sentencing provisions that I've described to you. What an amazing coalition. Durbin on the Democratic side, Grassley and Lee on the Republican side, and now President Trump. The stars are lined up in a way that we seldom see in Washington, D.C. And what we're going to set out to do with this bill, if we can pass it in the closing weeks of this session, is to give a chance to thousands of people still serving sentences for nonviolent offenses involving crack cocaine under the old 100-to-1 ruling, to give them a chance to petition individually, not as a group, petition individually to the court for a reduction in their sentencing. I've been through this. It's not easy. They have to go right back to the U.S. Attorney's Office that prosecuted them to get the thumbs up and approval to go forward. Many times they turn to victims, if there are victims in the crime, before any decision is made. They turn to the judges, particularly those sentencing judges who are still on the bench, and if they clear all those hurdles, they have a chance for a reduction in their sentence. Senator Grassley and I are about to introduce legislation that President Trump endorsed yesterday, and we'll begin working to build bipartisan support to pass it before we leave. Congress needs to pass this legislation. We have a different drug crisis facing us today. It isn't crack cocaine anymore. It's an opioid epidemic. It's a fentanyl epidemic. It's the deadliest drug epidemic that we've ever faced. And we have a totally different view of drugs than we did when Alton Mills was sentenced. In those days, most of the defendants were people of color, primarily African Americans. But today, this opioid epidemic has gone far beyond the hood. It's gone far beyond the inner city. It affects suburbs, even the wealthiest of suburbs, and towns, rural towns, no matter how small they are. And people are starting to think anew about what to do with drug addiction. Is our goal to put people in prison for drug addiction, or our goal to end the addiction? We know that some cases, those who go to prison won't use again. Many times they do. We know if people go successfully through treatment, they may be spared the addiction, and it may save their lives. We're coming of age when it comes to drugs in America. What we've tried to do with this bill is also take into consideration criminal defendants who meet certain criteria, limited criteria. Drug offenses, which is the #1 prosecution offense in our federal system. Drug offenders who are not kingpins, they're not the bosses, they're not involved in any violence in the crime, and there's no gun involved, and they are willing to cooperate with the government in closing down the drug operation. If they meet all those criteria, we say that the court can take that into consideration in sentencing. I think that's a good thing. I think in Alton Mills' situation, it would have resulted in a much, much different sentence than what he currently, or what he faced before the commutation by President Obama. We also want to make certain that in the future, those who were sentenced under the old 100-to-1 disparity, as I mentioned earlier, could petition the government for a reconsideration of their sentencing on an individual basis. No guarantee that they'll be released, but the opportunity to petition in those situations. I think this is a step in the right direction. Let me say that the bill also contains provisions which I think are extraordinary when it comes to prison reform. What are we going to do with all these people? Most of them who are in prison are coming out someday. Will they come out to commit another crime, create another victim? That would be a failure of the system completely. So 2 senators, one Republican, Senator John Cornyn of Texas, one Democrat, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, came together with a prison reform bill that's already passed the House with 386 votes. We've improved it some in the Senate, but it basically gives to those who are in prison an incentive to develop skills and training and education levels that will serve them when they leave, to reduce recidivism and reduce the commission of crime in the future. I think that is humane, it's sensible, and it says to those who truly want to turn their lives around, we're going to give you a chance to prove it. Prove it with your actions, and we'll give you a chance to be released earlier and to have a chance to go into society in a positive way. We brought these two together, criminal sentencing and prison reform, and it doesn't happen very often around here. The last time we had any measurable impact on the subject was 8 years ago. It was 8 years ago when I introduced my first bill on criminal sentencing reform. And I think that bill, which incidentally I co-sponsored with former Senator Jeff Sessions, I think that bill worked. It gave the individuals an opportunity to petition for early release. And in many cases, it saved their lives and gave them a chance. We're back. We're back with a bipartisan bill. It's called the First Step Bill. And this bill, I think, deserves our consideration in the United States Senate as quickly as possible. You see this empty Senate floor? This is a place to do business. We have some business to do. In the 3 weeks we'll be in session in the end of November and the month of December, we can easily pass this legislation. I sat down with Senator Grassley and Republican and Democratic leaders from the House. They are anxious, we're all anxious, to bring this up. I'm going to plead with Senator McConnell and ask everyone to join me to put this measure on the calendar. I believe it will have strong bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans will join in an effort endorsed by President Trump. How about that for your headline? You don't see often that sort of thing happening very often. We've got a chance to do it here with this revised First Step Act. I want to thank all those who've worked so hard on it, starting with Mike Lee, my original co-sponsor. Add to that Chuck Grassley, who has been a terrific partner, start to finish, in making this a bipartisan effort. And special thanks to Senators Cornyn and Whitehouse for marrying up their prison reform package with our sentencing reform package. This could be significant. It could be one of the most important things we do when it comes to criminal justice, not only this year, but for a long time. I commend my colleagues for their cooperation on that. And that front, I hope we can get this job done in the closing weeks of this session. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Madam President, on a separate note to be entered at a separate place in the record, I would like to say a few words about the legislation currently pending before the United States Senate. Every once in a while, and it doesn't happen very often, the stars line up. And the Democrats and the Republicans and the conservatives and the progressives and the president and the Congress agree on something. And I'm not talking about Flag Day or apple pie or whether Lassie was a collie dog. It really comes down occasionally to something that is meaningful. And we're in the midst now of a debate on the floor of the United States Senate, which will culminate probably tomorrow in some historic votes on the whole question of criminal justice reform. How important is this issue? It's so important that we rarely take it up more than once a decade, that we sit down and look at criminal justice standards and laws in America and decide whether or not we can make them better and more effective. Just a few minutes ago, my colleague from Texas, Senator Cornyn, a conservative Republican, came to the floor and explained how the state of Texas engaged in prison reform and found out that they could not only reduce the prison population, but reduce the incidence of crime at the same time. That's what we're setting out to do at the federal level as well. And Senator Cornyn's prison reform measure, which he introduced with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, has been a central part of our conversation on criminal justice reform. I had another part of criminal justice reform that I've been working on for a long, long time. You see, 3 decades ago, Congress responded to our nation's drug epidemic by creating the harshest mandatory minimum sentences in our history. Consider what happened next as we made the penalties for drug use and sales higher than ever in our history. What happened next was the use of illegal drugs in the United States of America actually increased, just the opposite of what we were trying to achieve. The availability of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine increased despite harsh criminal penalties. Crime rates for federal drug offenders did not go down. In other words, longer prison terms did not deter drug use or drug crime, but they did lead to an explosion in our federal prisons. Since 1980, the federal prison population has grown by over 700%. Federal prison spending has increased by nearly 600% in that period of time. Today, the United States of America holds more prisoners by far in prison than any country in the world. America has 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners, more than Russia or China. Our overcrowded federal prisons consume 1/4 of the Justice Department's discretionary budget. This undermines other important priorities like preventing crime in our neighborhoods and treating drug addiction. The largest increase in the federal prison population is for nonviolent drug offenders. This is largely because of the inflexible mandatory minimum sentences. These mandatory penalties don't allow judges to distinguish between drug kingpins, who should be our focus when it comes to criminal penalties, and lower-level offenders. That isn't fair, it isn't smart, it isn't an effective way to keep us safe. We also have to consider the racially disparate impact of these laws. Listen, the majority of illegal drug users and dealers in America are white. But 3/4 of the people serving time in prison for drug offenses are African American or Latino. Majority of the users and dealers, white. 3/4 of those who go to prison for drug crimes, African American and Latino. And the large majority of those subject to federal mandatory minimum penalties fall into that same group of African Americans and Latinos. As a result of mandatory minimums, the families of nonviolent offenders are separated for years on end. Most of these families are people of color. This has a destructive impact on their communities and erodes faith among them in our criminal justice system. Most senators don't come to the floor and say what I'm about to say, but let me tell you the worst vote I ever cast. I was a member of the House of Representatives, and it was about 25 or 26 years ago, when I voted for a law that established what became known as the crack powder sentencing disparity. That jumble of words means that under this law, it took 100 times more powder cocaine than crack cocaine to trigger the same minimum sentence. 100 times. This came to be known as the 101 crack to powder disparity. And under this law, 80% of the people sentenced for crack cocaine offenses were African American. In 2010, I worked with an unlikely ally, then Senator from Alabama, Jeff Sessions. He was the Republican senator and a member of the Judiciary Committee and felt strongly about this issue. And I said to him, Senator Sessions, 100-1 isn't fair. For a tiny handful of crack and a handful of powder cocaine, that the handful of crack would get 100 times the sentence as the cocaine doesn't make any sense. We debated back and forth. I thought it should be 1-1 in the sentencing. He didn't agree. But the day finally came when we had to make a decision. We actually bargained in the Senate gym. I know the Democratic leader referred to that gym earlier. We got a lot of business done there. We were bargaining in the gym on the day of the committee markup. Back and forth, and finally the two of us agreed it would go from 100-1 to 18-1. Don't tell me why 18, but it was a compromise. But it dramatically reduced the disparity in sentencing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. That Fair Sentencing Act passed the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Senate, the House Judiciary Committee, the House, was signed into law in a very private ceremony by President Obama, which Senator Sessions and I attended. For the last 5 years, I've been working on the next step, a bipartisan coalition of Republicans and Democratic senators to take the next step in reforming our federal drug sentencing laws. 5 years ago, I joined up with another unlikely ally, Mike Lee, very, very conservative Republican from Utah, to introduce a bill called Smarter Sentencing. We had a problem. There was a Republican senator who didn't like the bill at all. His name, Chuck Grassley, Iowa, conservative Republican, coincidentally, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. After a while, I said to Senator Lee, we're going nowhere without Grassley. We've got to get him on board if we're going to change the law. It took a year, which is just a few minutes in Senate time, but it took a year of negotiating for us to finally reach an agreement that Chuck Grassley and Mike Lee and I all signed on to for sentencing reform. We were joined by Senator Cory Booker in the last year or two, Democrat from New Jersey, and after more than a year of negotiations, we introduced the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, legislation approved by the Judiciary Committee by a vote of 16-5 earlier this year. Around the same time, the House of Representatives passed bipartisan legislation to reform the federal prison system. This bill was supported, listen to this, by President Donald Trump, co-sponsored by Republican Congressman Doug Collins, Democratic Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York, and Republican House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte of Virginia. I didn't like the original version of this bill because I thought we could do better and we should add criminal sentencing to prison reform. Then we did something that's rare. We sat down, Democrats and Republicans, and worked it out. We believed that we could come up with a common bipartisan bill by combining the two. The result is the most extraordinary political coalition I have ever witnessed in the time I've been in Washington. The so-called First Step Act, the revised First Step Act, is a bipartisan sentencing and prison reform bill that is sponsored by 34 senators, 17 Republicans, 17 Democrats. It is supported by President Trump and a broad spectrum of stakeholders. Listen who's supporting this bill on criminal sentencing reform and prison reform. The Fraternal Order of Police, it's a good starting point. The largest police group in America. The National District Attorneys Association, the largest group of prosecutors in America. So we have the police and the prosecutors, and we also have the American Civil Liberties Union. Go figure. That a bill we put together could bring these folks together in common purpose to pass it. Our bill would reduce federal mandatory minimum sentences in a targeted way. We don't repeal any mandatory minimum sentences, and we don't lower any maximum sentences. We would simply allow federal judges to determine in certain low-level cases on a case-by-case basis when the harshest penalty should apply. The bill also puts in place a recidivism reduction program, prison reform, that will facilitate the successful rehabilitation and reentry of prisoners. Senator Cornyn addressed that just a few minutes earlier. Let me tell you a story about this man here. His name is Alton Mills. In the year 1994, at the age of 24, Alton Mills was given a mandatory life sentence without parole for a low-level, nonviolent drug offense. When Alton Mills stepped into that federal prison cell with a life sentence, he was stepping into a jail cell for the first time in his life, and he was bound to stay there for the rest of his life. I ended up being contacted by his public defender. She has this wonderful name. She's from Chicago. Her name is My Angel Cody. My Angel Cody contacted me and told me Alton Mills' story, how this kid, growing up in Chicago, decent kid in high school, made a bad turn, got mixed up with a drug gang, was a sales runner on the street, just the lowest possible level, and on the third offense got a life sentence to spend the rest of his life in prison. I asked President Obama to take a look at this and consider commutation. And in December of 2015, after serving 22 years in prison, Alton Mills came home to Chicago. What's he done since then? He's become a mechanic at the Chicago Transit Authority. He got married. He's contributing to society. He has a granddaughter. He's working as a community college student, pursuing an associate's degree. If he hadn't received a pardon, Alton Mills was destined to die in prison because of the federal sentencing laws, which we're setting out to change. The First Step Act would eliminate this mandatory life sentence for nonviolent drug offenders like Alton Mills. And the bill would also give a chance to thousands of people still serving sentences for nonviolent offenses involving crack cocaine under the 100-to-1 standard I mentioned earlier. I'm going to have more to say about the pending amendments, which will be brought up tomorrow. senator from Arkansas is going to offer 3 amendments that I consider to be poison pills. After 6 years of hard work putting these bills together, Democrats and Republicans, police, prosecutors, the ACLU, President Trump and Durbin, together on a bill, and now comes a senator from Arkansas who has introduced 3 amendments which I think are very destructive to this bill. I'm going to oppose all 3 of them. And I hope he'll think twice about them. We have an opportunity to do something significant, historic, and bipartisan here for the good of this nation. We can end up reducing the crime rate in our country and do it in a smarter way with sentencing and prison reform. The amendments that he will propose tomorrow, the senator from Arkansas, have been opposed by groups across the board, left and right, conservative, progressive, Republican, Democrat. They all oppose his amendments. I'm not going to get into a specific discussion about them until later, but I wanted to let the senator from Arkansas know that we are hopeful that he will take a more constructive approach. If he goes with the amendments that we've seen, we're going to have to do our best to oppose him. Some are going to suggest this bill, that the underlying bill doesn't go far enough to unwind the harsh mandatory sentencing, which I mentioned earlier. I agree. But that's the nature of legislation. It's the nature of compromise. It's what the Senate's all about. A Republican-controlled Senate is considering a bill supported by senators from both sides of the aisle, and we have a chance to do something. Congress should make this bipartisan legislation a fitting ending to this year. For all of the cynicism and skepticism about what Congress can achieve, we can prove as soon as tomorrow, with one of the most historic changes in criminal justice legislation in our history, that we can work together for the good of this nation. Our people who send us to this job expect no less. Madam President, I yield the floor.